Welcome to week 8 of SPIMA 3P93. This week we are focusing on the monitoring and evaluation of sport for development programs. So very first thing you need to think about is don't go evaluating any programs until you go back and look at what the goals of the program were. Right? So hopefully you've established a series of goals and objectives, what you're hoping to desire, your end outcome for the participants. Maybe it's your leaders that are included in this, your corporate partners. So everybody has goals attached to what it is that you're looking at. And then you're monitoring that and evaluating it at the end. But again, it all comes back to a systematic approach that begins with your goals. So monitoring and evaluation really is a series of decisions that you'll be making based upon the type of program that you're offering, the type of evaluation that needs to be done in order to capture the type of change that you're hoping to capture. Let's just say for now in your program participants, how much money you have to spend on the evaluation, how many evaluations do you want to do. If you're monitoring on an ongoing basis, then what does that look like and who does that and what criteria would you be looking for, and then again the timing of that. There are 3 different types of evaluation. The first is a process monitoring, and the idea here is that you're watching and evaluating your program on an ongoing basis from the very beginning to the end. I'm just going to share a quick example of why it's so important that you do that process monitoring. So there was a program, and the program was meant to teach young girls about sexual health and prevention of AIDS, HIV, and other sexually transmitted diseases. And they had set up the program so that it was peer leaders who were playing games with the girls, but also instilling these messages about sexual health. So by looking at some of the external ways that you might evaluate the program, like attendance, it was really terrific. A lot of young women were coming out to the program. The peer leaders were also showing up, and they were on time, and they were well organized, and they always had the games and things planned. There was a lot of activity going on, a lot of kids, smiling, like in terms of were they enjoying the program. And so externally looking at the program, you say based on these measures, the program was really terrific. Well, what happened was after about 8 weeks of the program, they realized that there were such cultural taboos around the topic of female sexual health and sexual disease prevention that the peer leaders actually didn't deliver any of the program content. That the girls showed up and played the games, right? Had a lot of fun, so the attendance is great, but the actual program delivery in terms of the main reason for the program and content wasn't delivered at all. The second type of evaluation is a formative evaluation. So this is undertaken before the program actually begins and potentially maybe halfway through the program. But the idea is you want to understand the baseline level of the student's awareness or knowledge of a particular area before you undertake your program. What if you find out they already know about AIDS, HIV, and how to prevent transmission? And that's what you set up your program to, it's been designed to do, right? So, do that sort of a pre-test before you actually begin your program so you can understand what level the participants are actually at and make sure that your program design takes that into account. And then it also gives you a comparison to measure at the end of your program. So you can say X many students, graduated from high school, it was 60%, but those that took our program where they did an internship at a local business, 90% graduated, right? So you've got those comparisons, and that's of course capturing that data is very compelling to whether you're applying for a grant, you're trying to motivate a corporate partner to get involved in your program, or if you're applying for an award. The third type of evaluation is a summative evaluation. And essentially this is done at the very conclusion of the program, where you're capturing the information about what the participants actually learned based upon what the goals of the program were. So that's what understanding the goals and using the goals to set out what your evaluation mechanisms will be, how they'll be designed, is so critical. But there's really no point in doing your program if you're not going to evaluate it at the end. So the summative evaluation is absolutely critical. Next, we're going to look at what things you need to consider when you're actually designing your research. So I know that all of you have taken research courses as part of your time in SPIMA, and so you probably are fairly literate in this aspect of research. But what I'm going to do is highlight sort of the 6 main points that you really need to take into consideration when you're setting out to actually design the evaluation that you're going to undertake. When considering your research design, the first thing you need to do is, as I've said, go back to those research objectives. So what are the goals and the challenges you're trying to overcome in terms of the components of your program? Now, really don't look at more than 3 or 4 objectives, because then it becomes unrealistic and unwieldy in terms of the number of potential interview questions or surveys or whatever, however you're going to collect your data. So again, you want to sort of have realistic objectives that will evaluate the program, but again, you're not going to have 10 or 12 objectives. Really just try to focus on 3 or 4. So the next main consideration, sort of number 2 and number 3, is how best to collect that data. So point number 2 is assuming that you're going to use qualitative data to undertake your research. So are you going to do interviews? Are you going to do observations? Are you going to do an ethnography where maybe you're going to live with that group for an extended time period, and you're taking notes on what you see on an ongoing basis, interviews, like numerous types of a constellation of research to provide multiple sources of data that will go into it. Are you going to capture those exactly in field notes or in some type of maybe at the end have focus groups with the individuals who've participated in the program. Now, this is important to consider because depending on the locale of your program, there might be language barriers or language issues. So maybe observation is a better way if you can't undertake an interview or do focus groups. So these are the really critical, you need to take a look at all of these different types of qualitative approaches that you can use, and then decide which is best based upon the challenges or limitations that you may have in actually gathering the data. And in some cultures, they may not want a man interviewing a woman, for example, right? So then maybe making sure that you have, gender neutral, so a man and a woman there for the interviews, or women interviewing women. If you're doing a focus group, the same thing. So that cultural sensitivity is really important as you look at those qualitative types of research methods that you might use to capture your data. So the third approach is to use quantitative data. So here you might do a survey, you might do a content analysis, but remember that it really depends on the context. So you might not have access to photocopiers or paper or pens or pencils. Once again, there might be a language barrier. I know that in some cultures, if governments have come and asked them to sign pieces of paper, they will not do it. So you really need to find out a lot about the environment as you're choosing the type of method, if it's a quantitative method. Now, a content analysis, there if you're keeping attendance records, like using secondary sources of data, that might be a really effective way to do it. So once again, and also I'll mention that you could use a blend of qualitative and quantitative types of methods when you're doing your overall design, if you do have some of those limitations based on resources or culture. The fourth consideration in your design is around the cultural sensitivity, literacy, and that whole idea of gender and those types of sensitivities as well. So again, this is where you really need to count on someone with local knowledge to inform you about the boundaries of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what are the appropriate ways to contact people and reach out, and what types of questions might or might not be acceptable. So I'll just give you an example that here at Brock we had a graduate student that went to South Africa to undertake research. And what she did was she had a translator because she didn't speak the local language. And she thought that this would, she built this all into her. And when you're doing a PhD, I mean, you work on your research methods for months. So, this clearly went into a lot of thought, and the idea of having this translator. Now, what happened was that some of the vocabulary and the terminology that she would have used as a researcher might not have been easily translated into the local vocabulary. And what happened was that the person that was hired as the translator had real self-esteem problems and was really having a lot of difficulty because they didn't know. And when the researcher found this out, and that her research was causing this real harm to the person that was meant to be the translator, and likely it couldn't be fixed just by the nature of the vocabulary of the questions that she had set out. And of course your interview guide is approved by your committee. You can't just get into the field and then change your guide. And so she canceled her research altogether. Because she just knew that you can cause no harm when you go into these environments. This is something that she wouldn't have known before she went, but as soon as she found out the implications of her research on the translator, she decided to go back and redesign how she was actually going to collect the data to find out the results of the program. So the fifth consideration is who is actually going to conduct the research. So here, financing comes into question because ideally you would hire or have a third-party organization conduct the research. So why would you want to do that? Because it's unbiased. If you're going to take this research and apply for a grant or apply for sponsorship or apply for an award, then you want to show that a neutral party has collected that data. So, take a look at what it might cost to hire an organization, a research company, to come out and conduct that research for you. It might be cost prohibitive. An alternative might be to approach a university where they have a program in international development or sport for development, or maybe you're looking at sexual health among young girls and they have a scholar there that's looking at that. So if you can work with a university, that adds a tremendous amount of legitimacy to the findings of the research because it's a neutral party, but it's also a highly trained person that has received approval from a research ethics board and they've clearly have a lot of knowledge of research design, and they've conducted that research for you. So that's another way that you can have a third party conduct the research, but you can also save money by doing that. Obviously you might have to pay some of their expenses as well, or it might be great because it's a good collaboration because they can publish the findings of the research. And again, you'd have to check with your partners to see if that was okay before you agreed to that. But sometimes then it's a win-win for the academic and for the people who are delivering the program. Another key factor for consideration is that you could conduct the evaluation yourself, but you need to have some knowledge of how to do that. So you need to have taken some research courses in the past, and you need to be very fluid in terms of research design, survey design, developing interview guides. And it's a whole lot different to develop an interview guide and then actually try to sit there and ask those questions. Here in Canada, when I undertake my research, I generally ask people if I can tape record it, but in some cultures they may not want to be recorded. So you might actually be handwriting. So maybe you need someone to accompany you, and then maybe you have to pay that person. So you need to think about all of the details, and here the idea of the cultural sensitivity comes into play in that data collection, those methods as well. This is critical. You have to collect this data to find out about the effectiveness of your program or not. There are a few different options that you might have to collecting the data, but again, it really is very situational in terms of the money that you have, maybe a partnership that you have with the university, the amount of money that you might have, and the type of data that you're actually collecting. The sixth factor you need to consider in your research design, and I have to laugh because that took me 2 takes, but just leave that in, is how often you're actually going to gather your data. And again, this comes down to, is this, a formative, summative process? What type of research are you actually doing? But you need to make those decisions in advance, and it should be, you're going to be thinking about money, you're going to be thinking about resources, but the decision really should be made based upon, what you need to actually have that information at the end of the day to make key decisions. So if you want to monitor your program all the way along and adjust it and tweak it and make sure you're achieving its goals, then you really should embed that within the design early on. But those are the overall questions that you would take. So based on the 6 factors of research design, make sure that you set them all out way in advance, and then link them into your partners, link them into the finances, link them into the time frame that you have, link them into your own abilities. But it's absolutely critical that you set out your research design linked to your objectives well in advance. So before we conclude for today, I just want to share some information on cultural sensitivity and how important that is to undertaking any type of research or evaluation, whether it's in Canada or abroad. So the first one is understanding local norms, expectations, behaviors, and it might be simple as a handshake. Is that a practice down there, or is that not a practice down there? That's something that certainly is, essential and part of our cultural norms here in Canada, but maybe not overseas. Your overall attitude of the people that you're working with towards the participants, and your level of engagement in them, the knowledge that you have about their culture. You need to know enough about the people to even be gauging their comfort with your being there over time. So the story about the poor translator, that's something where you would definitely need to be aware enough of local cultural mores so you would catch something like that. Don't go in with preconceived notions about the people that you're going to be working with. Okay, so go down with a very open mind in terms of skills, abilities, knowledge, history, and a lot of that. So when we went to the Turks and Caicos, the passion that they had for sport and the support that we had from the schools and the government, it was unbelievable. When we were met at the airport by 3 government ministers, and they took all kinds of pictures of us. Our group was all over social media and in the newspaper, and of course we had no idea that this was going to happen. But it was an amazing welcome that showed us how much support we had for our program. But if you had the opposite happen, where you had resistance distance, restraint. People seemed to be uncomfortable. You didn't have access to people that you needed. They weren't giving you maybe the school or access to it. Then you would really need to rethink, should you actually be there and undertaking that program. Sometimes just like a mannerism or something that we might do here, it could be something that might really hurt somebody's feelings. So you need to be very careful about your level of engagement and your sensitivity, and continually, reading the room, reading the nature of the people with you. Maybe letting them lead the dialogue and tell you about their program rather than you sort of maybe leading that direction of the conversation. Language barriers can be a huge problem, and even trying to overcome some of those problems could be really challenging. So make sure that, again, you've really done that in-depth research into how you might overcome the language barriers and what the implications of that might be. So in talking about cultural sensitivity, just a couple more, just looking at building a rapport and respect for local iconography. So I'm just going to share a couple of stories. So when we were in Nigeria, my dad was working as part of a team, and part of the team were from Canada, and the other part of the team, they were local Nigerians, because of course they're the ones who are going to stay on and implement the program. And we continually had all of these parts of my dad's team over for dinner, and we would have it just seemed like every night we had different people over for dinner when I was growing up. We got to meet tons and tons of people, but it was that rapport building, that out of the office, let's go have a drink, come to our house for dinner. And in Nigeria, it was a real honor to be invited to someone's place for a meal. And in Nigeria, so the head of the Udoji Commission was actually King Udoji, and we were invited to his home for dinner, and the amount of respect that he had in terms of the culture and the people, and certainly the level of distinction that was given to him by my dad and all of the other people that were part of the team. So that rapport building, either through, as I said, those social encounters, or introducing someone to your family, really meant a lot in Nigeria. So I guess we were part of my dad's strategy, to really build a rapport. The other one is a little bit about local iconography. So I was really lucky when I finished my undergrad. I took a year off and did one of those, backpack around the world, where you buy the flight and you get, 3 stops as long as you go in the same direction. So I found myself in Nepal, and absolutely amazing. I think I mentioned earlier that it was run by a royal family that was given, tons of money by the World Bank, but they didn't spend it on roads or education or school. They kind of funneled it into Swiss bank accounts. Anyway, so I was in Kathmandu, and we went down to sort of the central square where there's these absolutely phenomenal temples that are literally like 1,000 years old, and we would just sit somewhere quiet and just watch the people go through their daily lives, knowing that maybe more so than any other country that I had visited, which was actually quite a lot by this point in time, that this country was kind of like captured in time. So because they hadn't taken all of that development money and changed it, it really seemed like we were in a time warp. And so we'd see people walking through their, day to day, they're picking up their groceries, they're going about their business, to buy something or pick up their children or what have you. And they would stop at a fountain and they would rub the fountain. And then you would see all of these local, statues and fountains, and they would be so worn because for 1,000 years people had been touching them, and it was part of their daily, something that they would have to do on their way. It was part of their daily, respect, I guess, for whatever that icon was. And they were deeply treasured by the people there. So as a visitor, it was incredibly important for us to demonstrate that same level of respect. So when we went to visit a temple, even though a lot of them were kind of layered temples with stairs, we didn't go running up and down the temples, right? These are incredibly precious. And as a visitor to that country, we really had to take a few days to acclimate just by watching how the people interacted and what they did and what were legitimate behaviors, what were not legitimate behaviors. And then you become much more comfortable being in that environment, especially when you know that you're not going to inadvertently offend somebody because they have a treasured statue that's in their square, that's been there for 1,000 years, and you've gone and maybe hung your camera up on this statue for a couple of minutes, while you're talking to somebody, right? So it might seem like a really small thing to you, but to someone else it might be very offensive. So another thing that I did, I went to Thailand. And at the museum, they had courses that you could take on the art and how the history and religion were embedded in the art in Thailand. And so the same thing, after having taken this course, I felt much more comfortable when we visited the different temples, because there are a lot of local practices about, you can never show your legs in a local temple, you can never wear your shoes in a local temple, and different things that you might have to do with scarves. And some of the temples might have a scarf or something that you could drape over your legs, but we always made sure that we brought our own. Again, it's part of that respect for the local culture. So you really need to make an effort to get to understand the local environment, whether it's through a formal educational process or just by watching local people, or maybe you have a guide that would take you places and provide some of that education as part of taking you around to the different areas of the city where you'll be working. But it's absolutely critical that you understand the culture where you're going before you do the program, and certainly before you do any type of research or evaluation, because you do not want to offend the people that you're genuinely there to help. So thanks very much for listening to today's lecture on monitoring and evaluation. And I think you've been introduced to some of the key decision-making practices that are really important. And certainly you'll find more information on Sakai.